Well, I think the main point is to fill in a gap that has developed because of the suppression of knowledge of the interaction of black people and Native American people. In other words, it's to tell the story to the fullest extent possible of the interrelations between these two ethnic groups with both extremely rich heritages of culture and history.
Where were the Native American population during the time that you studied?
Well, during that time period, I think virtually all areas of the Americas and all of the islands, virtually, including up to Greenland, for the most part, were occupied by different native people. So the entire continent and virtually all of the islands were occupied. The Spanish writer Bartolomé de las Casas, who is the principal author of that gives us the information from Columbus's diaries. Columbus chose to finance the conquest of the West Indies by selling Native American slaves, and he characterized it as his granjeria, or granary. In other words, it was the granary that was going to pay for the conquest, that is, Native American bodies. And Columbus himself sent at least 3,000 and possibly as many as 6,000 or more Native American slaves to Europe. This begins as early as 1493. On his return voyage, he takes about 24 Native Americans to Portugal and Spain. In the subsequent voyages, many, many more are sent, men and women. Now, he intends to sell them by the thousands, not only in Spain, but he mentions the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands off, the west coast of Africa. The Cape Verde Islands off, the west coast of Africa. The Cape Verde Islands off, the west coast of Africa. As well as in Portugal and Spain and elsewhere. So even before there are any appreciable number of African slaves being sent to the Americas, there are Native American slaves being sent to Europe, principally probably ending up in Lisbon and Seville, or Sevilla, in southern Spain. So even before there are any appreciable number of African slaves being sent to the Americas, there are Native American slaves being sent to Europe, principally probably ending up in Lisbon and Seville, or Sevilla, in southern Spain. So even before there are any appreciable number of African slaves being sent to the Americas, there are Native American slaves being sent to Europe, principally probably ending up in Lisbon and Seville, or Sevilla, in southern Spain.
Now, when people think of American slavery, they don't think of the enslavement of Native Americans. Why is this?
Well, partly because the enslavement of Native Americans occurred first. The enslavement of Native Americans occurred first. The enslavement of Native Americans occurred first.
Say that again, please. Say that again.
The enslavement of Native Americans really began before the enslavement of Africans. not only in the Caribbean by the Spanish, where it was extremely extensive. And in the Caribbean, I might mention that the numbers were huge that were involved, and they had several kinds of slaves. They had the normal slave, but they also had people who were called, they were called Indians from the useless islands. They were from islands where there was no gold. And so they had the right to go and remove people from those islands.
Useless islands?
Yeah, well, Jamaica, for example, would be a useless island because it had no gold. Inutiles, not useful. And they needed labor so badly on Haiti, where the gold was found, Haiti, and Cuba, that they were stealing people constantly and removing them by force from other islands, even after it was no longer technically in the best or possible, legally even, to enslave. They still could remove them as forced free labor, we could call it later coolie labor, right? And then they had other categories of unfree Indians as well. But once the population declined on the islands themselves, they began raiding the north coast of Venezuela and Colombia very extensively, also part of Panama. They also came up here and cleaned out the Bahamas completely. All the Lucayo people.
What period are we talking about now?
Well, we're into the 1440s, the 1540s, 1560s. Many people from Florida, South Carolina is raided for slaves, and also the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. Many Mexican Indians are sold as slaves, and it extends on into a much later period of time. But in short, the tremendous numbers of Native Americans were enslaved, and the Spaniards kept looking farther and farther afield for slaves to replenish the labor supply.